Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and we are back with more Massacre El Mozote. This was supposed to be last Tuesday's video, but we're getting into it here. Today we start Chapter 7, Washington's version. At the embassy, Greentree sat down and began to write, and by the following day, after consultation with Bleakley and review by others in the embassy, including Ambassador Hinton, a lengthy cable over the ambassador's name was dispatched to Washington. A cable that provided the basis for what Assistant Secretary of State Enders told Congress 2 days later. This cable, which was originally obtained in 1983 by Raymond Bonner under a Freedom of Information Act request, is a remarkable document. At its opening paragraph, the all-important summary that heads diplomatic cables reads, with emphasis added, as follows. Embassy investigation of reported massacre at El Mozote, including visit to the area by Assistant Defense Attaché and Embassy Officer, concludes following. Although it is not possible to prove or disprove excesses of violence against the civilian population of El Mozote by government troops, it is certain that the guerrilla forces who established defensive positions in El Mozote did nothing to remove them from the path of battle which they were aware was coming and had prepared for, nor is there any evidence that those who remained attempted to leave. Civilians did die during Operation Rescape, but no evidence could be found to confirm that government forces systematically massacred civilians in the operation zone, nor that the number of civilians killed even remotely approached number being cited in other reports circulating internationally. We are still pursuing question as to which army units were present at El Mozote. In summary, in the entire summary, only one point is considered solid enough to be dubbed certain: that the guerrilla forces who established defensive positions in El Mozote did nothing to remove civilians from the path of battle. And yet, as Greentree conceded to me, the descriptions of fighting in El Mozote and of the defensive positions there came largely, if not exclusively, from the Army briefings. The information that we had presented to us as concrete was, of course, from the Army side about the conduct of the combat operation, he said. The slender version of what happened in El Mozote seems to be a mixture of Army briefings and, at best, inferences by Greentree and Bleakley. The only point on which the investigators were ready to confer certainty for the rest of the summary consists of careful assertions of what could not be proved was a scenario they seem to have built up by combining Army briefings and their own speculation about what was a possibility. How could the investigators be certain that the guerrillas had nothing to, or did not, that the guerrillas did nothing to remove civilians from the path of battle? The day before the trip, to Morazan, another junior reporting officer had sent Bleakley a memorandum passing along the report of a source. The name is effaced in the version released by the government this fall, who, while skeptical of the reported numbers of dead, said that the military and did undertake a sweep, limpieza, of that area, that residents of the area were given time to leave it, that most did, and that among the unknown number of victims of the operation were some unspecified evangelicals who unwisely chose to stay behind. Bleakley does not recall the document, but he did say that that it conforms with my memory of the time that there were people who were part of the new evangelical movement in El Salvador who would live in guerrilla areas and manage to stay above the conflict. It may be that some of the odd language in the summary, nor is there any evidence that those who remained attempted to leave, was influenced by this memorandum. In any event, the assertion that guerrillas did nothing to remove civilians is actually contradicted later in the cable, where the authors describe an aged couple who said that the guerrillas told them to leave in early December. According to the cable, this aged couple returned to El Mozote after the fighting had ended and soldiers were in control. What did they find? They claimed they saw dozens of bodies. This claim is simply quoted without comment, as is the remark in the next paragraph by a man who knew of violent fighting in El Mozote and other nearby cantons, but was unwilling to discuss comportment of government sources, saying, "This is something one should talk about in another time, in another country." Those quotations, together with the fiat statements to me from Greentree and McKay, that it was clear to them at the time that something horrible had happened at El Mozote, that there probably had been a massacre, make the cable summary puzzling, to say the least. Read now the circumspect locutions that dominate the summary take on the aspect of shields. Judicious phrases by which the investigators deflected the burden of explicitly recounting that they strongly suspected had happened, or what had happened. What is curious is how, instead of building on their observations, inferences, and conclusions to present the best version possible of what probably happened, they emphasize the gap between what could be definitely proven to have happened, which, of course, wasn't much, given the reticence of the people and the constraints on the investigators' movements, and what the newspapers and the guerrillas were claiming had happened. It is a peculiar way of reasoning, built as it is on the assumption that in the absence of definitive proof, nothing at all can really be said to be known. In effect, officials made active use of the obstacles to finding out the truth. And formidable obstacles certainly existed in El Salvador in 1982. To avoid saying clearly and honestly that they knew and what they suspected. McKay, at least, seems to have been troubled by this at the time. We could not have said, "My God, there's been a massacre," he told me. But, truth be known, the ambiguity of the cable that went out, in my own conscience, I began to question it. And then when I saw the New York Times piece and the picture, that really got me to thinking. Bonner and I had gone to Quantico together, went to Vietnam together. McKay finally sent off another cable through my own channels, presumably a military or an intelligence circuit. And though I can say categorically that I actually wrote something horrible happened, what I said was to the effect that something had occurred because of the fear we had detected from the people there. McKay, of course, had reviewed the State Department cable before it was sent, but he was not its author. Greentree was. Though he was only 28 years old, Greentree had already earned the respect of his Foreign Service colleagues, and what was much rarer in El Salvador was considered a competent, trustworthy official by many in the press corps. Indeed, even a decade later, in this understanding of what had happened in El Salvador, he seemed to me the most perceptive of the American officials I interviewed. It was Greentree who embodied the United States government in the closest contact it would make to the massacre at El Mozote. And yet it was Greentree who provided the reporting that would enable the government to deny that the massacre had happened. It is tempting to conclude that he simply suppressed what was inconvenient, but the truth of what happened in the writing of the cable, like most of the United States dealings with the issue of human rights in El Salvador, is rather more interesting than that. Greentree's recollection during a series of telephone interviews of the writing of the cable and of its contents followed a fascinating progression. As I recall, he told me, I gave the military account the benefit of the doubt, but I probably put in the summary more ambiguity about what I felt. He went on to say there were probably a few times in there that emphasized that, hey, we infer from some of the information we picked up that something happened and so on. When he had told no such ambiguity could be found in the summary, that in effect the only ambiguity in the cable was the conflict, wholly unacknowledged, between the conclusions and some of the observations in the body. He said he imagined that in the clearing process, that got taken out. The clearing process in which the cable made the rounds of officials in the embassy for review centered on Kenneth Bleakley and his recollection of the trip. Alone among the recollections of the three coincides with the conclusions drawn in the cable. Nonetheless, Greentree insisted to me that he did not feel that what went out distorted beyond acceptability what he had written. In a later comment, he stated emphatically, at no time during my 4 in El Salvador was a report that I had anything to do with ever distorted by the embassy, because those are the standards that Hinton set. Like many in the embassy and throughout the Foreign Service, Greentree had great respect for Ambassador Hinton. He describes Hinton as a totally credible person, and in writing that what he wrote, he clearly felt the pressure to conform to the older man's standards. Yet, it is hard not to suspect that Greentree's strong belief that the cable contained more ambiguity than, in fact, it did reflect a lingering unease with the final product, a conflict that persists even after 12 years between what he wrote and what he felt he should have written. I had been in the Foreign Service for only a couple of years at that time, Greentree told me, and we had a very strong ambassador, and our instructions were to be clear and clean. Do not distort. You write it down, and then that becomes the eyes and ears of the United States government. And this was especially important because the journalists reporting in El Salvador were thought to be biased. So if I had said everyone was crying and everything, well, that wouldn't have had any credibility either. We reported what we saw, and the main requirement was to distinguish between what you saw and what other people said, you know. What was information and what was just thought, and even more than the standards of journalism, to keep your slant out of what you were reporting. What that leads to, though, is great frustration, and that was my feeling. I mean, I was frustrated because it wasn't a satisfactory account. Had he not been operating under the constraints of politics in Washington, what would he have written differently? Well, I would have put in more strongly the impression that abuses against the civilian population probably took place in El Mozote and the surrounding areas during that operation. But, he repeated, it was just an impression. There was no direct corroborating evidence. So yeah, I'll go ahead and end this in that episode here. Yeah, we are beginning to see how the connections in Washington wanted to treat the event. And it's not good. It's not good. They were seeing the massacre as, oh, it is, it is something we couldn't avoid. The guerrillas didn't do their part to keep civilians out. It should still be on your as part of your responsibility to say, hey, these people are likely innocent. But no, you have trained the people, the group that went in there, the Otlakotl, to be like, I don't care who it is, just murder them all. And they just, they don't care. But, part of what goes on is that you can't have a cable that makes you look uncaring. And so you notice how carefully they pick and choose what's said. They're like, we don't want to lie, but we don't want to acknowledge. It's one of those very lawyer-like writings or statements. As per da 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 da, but da 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 da. And honestly, yeah, it's so stupid. And they cry, oh, but we feel the media had a bias. Assholes. You're the ones trying to not give, any information to the public that may come back to bite you or your bosses on the ass. But no, they're not going to take responsibility. Of course. But we'll go ahead and end there. As always, educate thyself, Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.